As an update on the 0561 from Zero Tolerance. After I did a little bit of woodwork that I talked about in the last video, and I checked the edge, I was surprised to find that it had seriously degraded. Now normally one of the low end benchmarks that I use for edge retention is to do 1,000 slices into spruce, pine, or fir, just scrap lumber, and verify the edge doesn't have any chips, nicks, rolls, dents, and can still easily slice newsprint. I hadn't done a fraction of that level of work with this, and the edge was just gone. I could easily rub my fingers over it, had no slicing aggression. Very surprising. Check the edge under magnification and it was visibly dented in. There was significant deformation. And again, this was soft wood. Now, don't want to jump to immediate conclusions because there's always the possibility that, well, maybe the wood was a bit dirty, you didn't notice it, hit something else. I might have been cutting something before or slightly after that, just slipped my mind. So you just make a note in your edge retention column and move on. When I went to sharpen it then, first thing I took was a really fine grit polishing stone, Arkansas black, while I was watching an episode of Fringe. After de-stressing the edge and then tried to reform it, thousands of passes per side did nothing, which you would expect on a very abrasion resistant steel. Back down to 1,000 grit King, apex the edge instantly. Brought it back up to an 8,000 grit finish, but the edge wouldn't apex clean. You could easily see irregularities in the edge, much greater than you would expect for an 8,000 grit finish. Backed it down to 600 grit, and again the edge would not form clean. There's little waves, little hooks in the edge, and the sharpness was less than about 50% of what I'd consider optimal for that stone and that finish. Another mark in the edge retention column indicating issues with the steel. Do the edge retention run on cardboard, and almost immediately, even with some light work, the edge degrades very fast, like a type 1 class steel. Check the edge under magnification again. Deformation and chipping at the same time, which is not a good sign. Continue on and complete the edge retention run. Very low performance, and by the end of the run, which is about 250 meters of cardboard cut, the edge is showing significant deformation and chipping. Resharpen the edge again, de-stress it, shape it, bring it up to around 3,000 grit waterstone, again to check and see if the edge will form cleanly, and it doesn't. Again, there's irregularities in the edge, much larger than a 3,000 grit stone. I micro bevel it at a very high angle, take that off, micro bevel it, take it off, micro bevel, take it off, 3 times to see if the edge will apex cleanly. It won't. So at this point, it's not useful to do further edge retention runs on cardboard, because since the edge is not able to form a clean apex, it shows that there's something wrong with the steel, and the low sharpness itself is going to influence edge retention significantly in the negative. But of course, if it's not able to take a very fine apex, it's obviously not going to hold that in use. Now, as to what could cause that, there's three very broad basic reasons. One is issues with the actual processing in the mill. There could be inclusions in the steel, there could be voids, there could be issues with the way it was normalized or rolled. All of these are relatively rare because of the extensive QA practices in high-end mills, especially with powder metallurgy steels. The other thing is that it could be the way that it's thermally processed by the manufacturer, the way it's heat treated. In general, again, that's kind of unlikely for similar reasons. It's done with very high-end equipment usually. The controls on modern heat treating equipment is relatively extreme in terms of tolerances. And heat treat defects generally are not singular. So if they happen, you tend to see widespread reports of identical sort of results, because it's not like the knives are heat treated one at a time. The most likely cause is that it was overheated in the final grinding or sharpening. That's a singular operation done by an individual who just could have leaned a little too hard on this one, used the worn belt, did too many passes without letting the blade cool. Any number of things. So I'm hoping after I carry this and use it for a while and just get a feel for general usefulness as a cutting utility tool, I'll come back and revisit it and find that the issues with sharpening and edge retention has improved. But as it stands right now, this would be a very frustrating experience for a lot of people. Again, because this is a very high-end particle metallurgy steel, but the performance is extremely low-end in many respects. And the only thing which is relatively standoutish from the point of it being expensive powder metallurgy steel is the fact that it's very difficult to grind, which ironically is one of the few things that you can't sort of affect in a dramatic way, no matter how poorly the heat treat is done, or no matter how badly you would burn it at the edge or damage it. You won't significantly reduce the grindability. So that's kind of funny. The problem or the drawback always stays, even if you don't get the advantages due to mistakes in manufacturing or processing. It's kind of amusing. As two other follow-ups, as a friend of mine noticed, and I'll give a link to each video down below, this knife works better in sort of a far back sabre type grip than it does in a hammer grip. Now, I was doing some work with it yesterday, and this is the way I was doing a lot of the cardboard cutting in particular. And while I won't say this is a comfortable grip, I will say it's not as uncomfortable as trying to do hammer style cutting with it. And one of the nice things is you can see how the handle curves in this area. Okay, maybe curves is not the best choice because it's essentially two very large radius flats, but in any case, it sort of adapts this little hump to the center of your palm. And because you're not directly into most of the jimping anymore, it's not as abrasive as trying to do heavy hammer style cutting with it. The other thing that helps this out significantly in use, and that's one of the connections between ergonomics and cutting ability and handle security and edge retention, is that the very thin primary grind that was put on by Collie Harris of CKC Knives dramatically reduces the force needed to cut, which again, because you're cutting with less force, you're holding onto it with less force, so the ergonomics are increased. And again, as was asked, and is a very appropriate question to ask, how are you confident that Collie Harris of CKC Knives didn't damage the knife when he reground it? It is possible, and it's a relevant question to ask. All I would say is that Collie is grinding these knives one at a time in a setting where he's not rushed. He's very familiar with the differences between low grindability and high grindability steel. He's very careful to use fresh belts. When he's actually sharpening a knife, he uses damp belts. He sprays them, and he never actually ground the edge itself. He was just working above it. So again, I don't know that, but what I do know, it's much more likely that the person in a high volume production setting who actually ground the edge is far more likely to have damaged it than Collie would. As one last point, I did get a response back from the manufacturer about if this knife is actually warranted under heavier use, such as prying. Because one of the questions I had when I first looked at it is, if you're going to use it for just light cutting, you know, paper, cardboards, plastics, foams, it's dominated by something like this, which is an extreme example of what a knife looks like just for that type of work. This is the Havalon Paranta Edge, and it uses disposable scalpel blades essentially. So this is optimized for that work. Now if you want to make the knife a little bit more capable for non-cutting work, you're going to end up with something like this, which is the Ritter Grip from Benchmade, and of course it has a much thicker blade than the Havalon Paranta, and it's able to take more lateral loads and impacts. But when I asked the manufacturer, well, you know, is this blade actually warranted under heavier use such as prying, the response was no, that it's not. And if the blade gets broken under prying or other heavy use, you had to pay for it to get replaced, which puts me as a consumer in sort of an odd position. If I restrict this to just light cutting, where, you know, I'm not doing any prying, I'm not doing any hacking, any chopping, any of that kind of work, it's dominated by other knives. It's heavier in hand. The thickness of the blade stock is going to reduce cutting ability. The width of the blade is going to reduce the ability to turn, ability to contour. And of course, you're just carrying around something that's significantly bigger. But if you do use it for non-cutting type work, it's not covered under the warranty. So it's an interesting position that you have a tool which is not actually warranted for the only applications for which it would excel over other tools, which cost considerably less than what it does.